Hi everybody, welcome to the Centre for Public Health Research seminar series. Thank you all very much for coming along. I will now pass you over to Andy Smith, who is doing our first seminar of the series from Department of Sport and Exercise Sciences. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Gemma, thanks for the invite. Well, I'm not sure it was an invite, but there was a slot at the beginning of the session and no one wanted to do it, so I think I'm here under those kind of false pretences. But hopefully what I've got to say today is of some interest to people in the room, and in many respects it's grown out of my own developing interest in the relationship between mental illness, elite sport and the wider society, which was stimulated for the most part, actually, and most strikingly, the BBC broadcast Mind Games as part of the Inside Sport programme in late 2009. And in addition to that, it also stems in many respects from my own reading of several autobiographies of elite sports athletes in which they've openly recorded their own experiences, not only of mental illness such as depression, but also their related use of drugs of both illegal and illegal kind. So it's only fairly recently, actually, that my academic interest, such as it is, developed in this kind of area. And today, in many respects, represents a thinking through, I think, if you can think twice, about these kinds of issues. And today I want to look at 4 interrelated problems in the next half hour, 45 minutes or so. Firstly, I'll briefly consider the prevalence of depression in society more generally as a backdrop against which to discuss elite sport and depression through a series of case studies, hopefully of people who you've heard of. And then I'll go on to try to explore preliminarily the kind of society-specific processes and those which relate directly to sport that may help us to explain much more clearly and adequately depression and elite sport. I think it's incumbent on me to add a caveat at the beginning. I'm not an expert in psychology, so if you're a psychologist, I apologise if I get most things wrong. I'm not a psychiatrist, so I'm not an expert in that. In fact, I'm an expert in pretty much nothing, except my training in sociology. So what I'm going to offer today is a little bit more of a psychological introduction or take on this modern problem between mental health and depression, just to give you some kind of context to what I'm going to talk about, and for those of you who may not have seen the programme that I referred to earlier. This is the setting of the scene, really, that provides the backdrop to today's session.
Nobody is immune to this mental illness. Fame and wealth offer no protection, and when depression strikes, the effects can be devastating.
It just comes on you, and it just squeezes everything. Your heart races, you panic. I've been on a plane where I've just wanted to say, I've got to get out of here.
It's really hard to explain, but like a build-up of pressure inside you, and that's generally for me sleepless nights, not eating properly, not being able to concentrate or focus on things during the day. They all sort of then put it together, and it creates one big storm.
I was waking up on the hour every hour, you know, and just the bed would be soaking with me sweating, and just think to myself, what is wrong, you know?
Sometimes you just get agitated, you pick arguments, you get aggressive, your mood changes, and all sorts of like different things happen to you. And unfortunately for me, I got sectioned.
I seriously thought that someone was going to put me in a straitjacket and lock me away.
I'd be in a room full of people and just feel the loneliest guy in the world, and the only thing I wanted to do would, you know, either lie in bed or shut myself away.
I thought considered sort of hurting myself just to show people how much pain I was in, because people talk about, you know, if you've got a broken leg, you've got a cast on your leg or whatever, and people can see you've got a problem. But when you've got mental problems, there's nothing evident to people to show you that you need help.
Some kind of physical mark that people can
say,
absolutely. That's what's wrong with him.
That's what you need to show people at times, and there you go, and that's what it is. But there was none of that for me. It's just, of course, that makes it hard work for people who suffer with the illness.
So that's a brief clip from the Inside Sport programme, which I referred to earlier. And you may be familiar with some of the athletes who were featured in that clip. And I'll return to some of them later on in the session, but just as a means of orientating people to what I'm talking about and to begin to adequately understand, I think, mental illness such as depression and elite sport, I think it's important to briefly note at least the socially patterned nature of mental illness and depression in society more generally. Many of you may be familiar with the World Health definition World Health Organization definition, which is now well accepted by all the major experts in the field, and that refers to depression as a common, and I emphasise the word common, mental disorder that presents with depressed mood, loss of interest or pleasure, feelings of guilt or low self-worth, disturbed sleep or low appetite, low energy and poor concentration. Not all people who experience depression will display or report those symptoms, but many of them will be experienced in concert or individually. In terms of the other prevalence data which we currently have available to us, I picked out one or two key things that perhaps are a little more striking. Firstly, there's currently estimated to be between 850,000 and 1 million British 5 to 16-year-olds attending secondary schools in the UK who are said to be mentally ill, many of whom have symptoms of depression and have clinical diagnoses of depression. Around 850,000 people die each year from depression-related suicide, and the majority of those occur amongst men under 45. And at the moment, there's around 30 young men killing themselves every week from depression-related suicide in the UK alone. And at the moment, suicide rates for men are 2 to 3 times higher than women in most Western countries, despite the fact that women are more likely to report experiencing depression and mental disorder of various kinds. So whilst depression is often, and other forms of mental illness is not generally regarded as important or as significant as physical illnesses, perhaps such as cancer and other serious illnesses, it nevertheless is a serious condition with serious consequences. And at the moment, it's estimated that by 2020, depression will be the second cause of disability in the world, second only to heart disease. So it is a serious condition, and the socially patterned nature of it was indicated by Wilson and Pickett's study, which has been published recently in the book called The Spirit Level, which many of you may be familiar with. And the authors argue convincingly, on the basis of international data, that the prevalence of depression is higher in more unequal societies than it is in more equal societies, and that is strongly related to social class, less so to gender. So if you look at the figure as it's presented on the screen here, the USA at the top, which is the most unequal society in the world, there are more than 1 in 4 people who experience depression at some point in their lives. That drops to around 1 in 5 in the UK, and then in Australia, the second most unequal societies in the world at the moment. And if we move down to the bottom left of the figure, towards Japan, Germany and Spain, including Belgium, there's around less than 1 in 10 people reporting depression of various kinds. So that means that on those data, for the UK at least, there could potentially be 3 people in this room who will have a clinical diagnosis of depression. That gives you some indication of how prevalent the disorder is and that how common it is across many societies, including the UK. Despite the socially patterned prevalence of mental illness, though, no one group is immune from its effects. But one group who are not generally thought to be susceptible to the pressures of modern-day life, living in modern-day societies, particularly in relation to the economic pressures which characterise modern industrial societies, are elite athletes. But how can elite athletes be depressed when they have so much going for them? Given many successful sports people receive substantial salaries and earnings and lead celebrity lifestyles, it may seem strange even to bother asking that question. And I'm hoping that some of you may be intrigued as to how I'm going to justify looking at that by being here. But I do want to do that from a psychological point of view today. Some of you may be aware of some of the more popular instances, or the more recent instances of depression in elite sport. The top right-hand picture refers to the German football goalkeeper Robert Enke, who committed suicide in November 2009, having experienced depression for over 6 years. And that depression was intimately related to and caused further disruption in his life following the death of his 2-year-old daughter in 2006 from a rare heart condition. And the revelation, such as he feared it, that he was experiencing depression, led him to take his own life in fear of the fact that the authorities may take his child from, his adopted child rather, from himself and his wife. The second case, the second picture on the right-hand side here, is the rugby league player Terry Newton, whom some of you may be familiar with. And he was a Great Britain rugby league player who was found hanged in September 2010, just under a month ago, who had experienced mental illness for several years, but that was strongly related to his banning for being found guilty for using human growth hormone, the first sports person ever to have been banned for 2 years from his sport for testing positive for human growth hormone. They're two of the more serious fatalities of which we're aware in the world of elite sport. And one which hasn't resulted in a fatality, thankfully, thus far, but which nevertheless attracted significant media attention is that of Ricky Hatton, who was admitted to the Priory in Cheshire, just up the road, in September 2010, a week or so before Terry Newton's case, after using cocaine, which was related, it seems now, to his experience of depression and alcohol abuse for several years whilst he was a professional boxer. Despite these individual cases, though, we're particularly constrained by the lack of available and systematic data on the prevalence of mental illness, such as depression, in elite sport. And in fact, at the moment, most of our understanding, limited that it is, comes from the autobiographical accounts that I'll talk a little bit about today, and in many cases through media revelations, not necessarily of mental illness, but actually through related behaviour such as the use of illegal drugs and alcohol abuse in particular. But let me just consider some of these case studies in a little bit more detail that derive in the main from the autobiographical accounts that I've begun to familiarise myself with over the last few weeks and months or so. The first is taken from Neil Lennon, who, for those of you that don't know, is the top right picture there, who was a former professional footballer both in England and then latterly in Scotland, and is now currently the manager of Celtic Football Club. When asked about how he disclosed his experience of depression to people within modern football, his comment was this: the reaction of a lot of players, which is symptomatic of elite sport more generally, what's he got to be depressed about? But it's not about that, it's an illness. Until you've experienced it yourself, you can't really explain it to anyone. I was just vacant. People think young, strong men shouldn't be depressed, particularly so in relation to professional football. And many other athletes, including John Kirwan, who were featured in the Inside Sport programme that I noted earlier, also disclosed quite frequently in his autobiography that one of the common coping strategies that many elite athletes adopt in relation to their experience of depression and mental illness is to privatise it. That's to say, to adopt whatever strategies they can to hide it from their fellow peers, colleagues, and the media in particular, for fear of intrusion in their lives. John Kirwan, the New Zealand rugby union player, now retired, who's since come out to discuss his experiences quite publicly, went on to say, it just comes on you, as you may have heard in the clip, and it squeezes everything. Your heart races, you panic. People see people who they think are superhuman or super lucky, and the good income that often comes with top-level sport. That, I would argue, is the way that many people view elite sports people. They're superhuman, they receive fabulous incomes, and they're not supposed to experience particular problems related to their mental well-being. He went on to add that I was in bed all day crying, shaking. The depression becomes such an important focus of your life. Notably, nobody with whom Kirwan played was aware of his experience of depression or mental illness. The first time this was disclosed was in interviews following his retirement from the sport. And the reason for that was because of the fear that he felt could result in him not being able to play rugby union anymore from being isolated and stigmatised in the world of elite sport, which, remember, is the very antithesis of what mental illness is about. Elite sport is supposed to be about strength, success, competition, whereas mental illness is frequently framed within society more generally as being a sign of weakness, fragility and failure. And many people whose job it is to play sport are acutely aware of this. And so aware are some people in relation to the problems that mental illness may pose for them professionally in terms of their performance. It leads some of them, as in the case of Kelly Holmes, to engage in a variety of self-coping strategies. Kelly Holmes is perhaps the most famous person to many of you in the room on the slide there. Some of you may be aware or may not be aware that throughout her career she was susceptible to injury and illness, usually around the time of major championships such as the Olympic Games, the IAAF Olympic Athletic Championships and so on. In the 2000 Olympics, she only, in inverted commas, achieved a bronze, having been injured and ill before the Olympic Games, and then dropped out of the 2004 Games. And her means of coping with the depression, to which only she knew, was to cut herself with scissors every day. And this is what she went on to say: "I just came to the end of my hope." In other words, being injured all of the time, having to deal on a day-to-day basis with the failure that she perceived herself as undertaking. "I just came to the end of my hope. I felt depressed and I cut myself with scissors. And I got desperate for things to go right for once, to be completely free of injury. Everything in my life at the time was wrong. When you're in it, you don't see a way out." Notably, she cut herself before training, after training, before competition and after competition. And the amount of times she cut herself was related to the amount of times not only she felt depressed, but crucially the times that she couldn't train when she was injured, the time that she felt down, and the time that she felt as if she was being isolated within the world of elite sport. On some occasions, she cut herself up to half a dozen times a day. So some people, some elite athletes, try to internalise and privatise their experience of depression, such as the fear that they experience within the world of elite sport. But in other cases, though, such as the boxer Frank Bruno, not only are they expected to manage their experiences of depression in private, but they also have to do so in public. Yet in the full glare of the media attention that traditionally accompanies elite sport. As Bruno said on his view as a celebrity, "I was public property, a celebrity, as they say. You have to live up to an image someone else has created for you. My image has always been the happy-go-lucky joker." Many of you may be familiar with his casting as a pantomime villain or as a pantomime character. That was how he was known. He was not known for the real Frank Bruno, in his view. And this pressure to live up to a preconceived identity as an elite athlete and nothing more, nothing less, was at the heart of his diagnosis from bipolar disorder in 1998 and his descendants into what sociologists call a state of anomie. Emil Durkheim defined anomie as a state of normlessness, where our sense of social regulation declines and where many of us feel unguided in the choices that we have to make on a day-to-day basis. This concept of anomie, sociologically, I think, is important because, as Bruno's case illustrates quite clearly, when many elite athletes have to retire, whether it's through injury or voluntarily, their whole support networks disintegrate. Their day-to-day liaison with coaches, with promoters, as in the case of Bruno, in many cases in terms of fans, other teammates, they're the people who regulate the behaviours of elite athletes. When those people go, many elite athletes, as in Bruno's case, begin to miss the sport which they loved. And this has certainly been the case in relation to Ricky Hatton as well, although we haven't heard what he has had to say about this more recently. But for Bruno, writing in 2005, he noted that "I missed boxing. I really missed it, because that was all he was known as, either the pantomime villain or a boxer, and at that, a failed boxer in his eyes. Having retired from boxing, within 2 years he began to turn to the use of cocaine. His life prior to that had already been characterised by the use of cannabis on the streets of London and in rather working-class Afro-Caribbean societies. And cocaine for him was a means by which he could manage the experience that he had of both of anomie, but also of the normlessness that he felt. And he said, "I loved the buzz cocaine gave me. It replaced the buzz of boxing. I didn't know who to turn to and I was lonely. This was worse than anything I'd been through in the ring. This is the person who, for some stupid reason, got into the ring with Mike Tyson twice. And yet the biggest fight of his life, as he put it, occurred not during in the ring, but upon retirement." Throughout his autobiography, he returns to this idea many times. And he went on to argue that I was leading a double life upon retirement. I was confused, I didn't like myself, and it also takes a while for me to trust anyone now. The reason why it takes a while for him to trust anyone is during his life as a boxer, there were so-called hangers-on in his life, people with whom he didn't have direct contact, but who nevertheless joined the celebrity gravy train. And many of the people who he became associated with upon retirement were drug traffickers, gang leaders, and cocaine dealers. And that, in many cases, helped to underpin the headlines of a national newspaper which reported on Bruno's sectioning under the Mental Health Act in 2003. Some of you may have seen the headline of the Sun in previous guises, but this headline was the first press release of the Sun when it was revealed that Bruno was taken away from his own home under the Mental Health Act. But such was the outrage over the bonkers Bruno locked up headline, particularly from the mental health fraternity, and also amongst his family and others within elite sport who were close to him. The Sun had to withdraw from circulation all of those newspapers and then replace it with a more balanced headline. But the damage at that point had been done. Lying behind that headline was a socially constructed nature of mental illness, particularly in relation to somebody who, on the face of it, was constructed within society as someone who was strong, who was self-determined, and who was a competitive fighter. His construction as someone who experienced mental illness was the direct opposite to that. And what Bruno's case tells us, sociologically at least, and I think this is where the experiences of elite athletes begin to overlap very closely to those people within the wider society, is that in relation to his celebrity, one of the kind of dark sides of unintended outcomes, as sociologists might put it, is that mental illness and celebrity demands that athletes' personal troubles, for example, mental illness, become public issues, as C. Wright Mills, the sociologist, famously said. So the personal troubles, the private issues to which Kerwin, Holmes and Neil Lennon describe, often, but not always, actually become public property. It becomes part of the celebritification that continues to characterise many modern industrial societies, such as the UK and Britain in particular. Bruno's case and many other cases within the world of elite sport also reveal quite clearly the inadequacies of assuming that elite sports people are somehow immune from the experiences of depression and other forms of mental illness. Because just like many other people within the wider society, financial position, particularly those who are financially well off, is not a sufficient protection against experiences of mental illness. Andre Agassi, who was famously quoted and during the publication of his autobiography, was quoted as saying that he absolutely hated tennis. He was one of the most successful tennis people of the modern time, but every single tennis match, every single tournament, he regretted and he never looked forward to, in part resulting from the pressure placed on his father to compete in elite tennis, but crucially because of the isolation which he experienced as a teenager growing up in an elite sport environment 2,000 to 3,000 miles away from his parents in the US. He went on to say, I tell myself that you can't be unhappy when you have money in the bank and you own your own plane. But I can't help it. I feel listless, hopeless, trapped in a life I didn't choose. A bit like Bruno. In part, it was related to his parents, particularly his father's encouragement into elite sport, but crucially because he didn't choose to be a celebrity. He didn't choose to be Andre Agassi. Yeah? He was somebody who was hounded by people I can't see, to which he means the media. Feeling depressed after a loss is one thing, but feeling depressed about nothing, about life in general, is another thing altogether. So his hatred of elite sport, his experience of mental illness and depression, led him to express particular elation upon his retirement from tennis. Many of us around here may say, why would you ever want to give up life as an elite athlete being in the public eye? But perhaps as Marcus Trescothick, the England international cricketer, also puts it, this might encourage us to think twice about that view. Marcus Trescothick, in the only sports book ever to win the William Hill Prize, that is not written by an athlete, went on to say in his autobiography, in many cases, that depression doesn't care who it attacks. If it wants you, you cannot beat it off with a CV or bank balance. Every hour was like a day, and every day seemed like an eternity. He was referring here to his experiences from 2004-2005, when he was diagnosed with a series of stress-related illnesses that could be traced back to his childhood. And for those of you that are not familiar with international cricket, when England or any other international cricket fixtures occur each year, this often results in athletes being away from home for up to 9 months of the year. So being separated from his family was part of the stress-related illness, and this exacerbated him feeling depressed. He said all of it was dark, bleak, sad, terrifying and awful, and I couldn't take it any longer. This was not a life, the life of an international cricketer. It was a living death, and it was just too dreadful to put up with. The Trescothick's case also illustrates the inadequacies of single causal explanations of depression. In fact, for the most part, depression is most adequately understood, not just from sociology, not just from psychiatry, psychology or biology, but as a combination of three interrelated phenomena. That is the physical states that people experience and the symptoms which they experience, principally in relation to chemical imbalances in the brain, especially in relation to neurotransmitters like serotonin, the psychological constraints to which individual people, not just elite athletes, are subject, and that relates especially to how they perceive themselves and the circumstances surrounding them, but also, crucially, the ways in which both of those are socially conditioned. That's to say, how the social relationships with whom elite athletes knowingly or unknowingly have with many other people come to influence the ways in which they conceptualise both themselves and then their illness. Looking back now, Trescothick went on to say in his autobiography, I fully understand that, far from rational thinking on my part, this train of thought, the ways in which he perceived himself, was driven by the illness, what he called the demon in his head. In 2006, which is when Trescothick retired from international cricket, he continues to play county cricket. He recalled a moment when he was standing in the field on the boundary, close to some England fans, and he was standing there and he couldn't recall anything that was going on the pitch, anything that the fans were saying, and he didn't ever recall any directions given from his captain. And the reason he knew that he couldn't do, that he didn't recognise that, was because, in his words, the illness had come back. The bastard had returned, apologies for the language, and the shadow cast by, as he conceptualised it, its black wings had consumed me again. The fight was over. I had no fight left. Once he left the pitch in tears, not after batting or at the end of an interval, it might be added, he actually walked to the umpire and said, I need to go to the toilet, and never returned to the field. Once he returned to the dressing room, he recalled that I just sat on the couch, facing the wall, with my head in my hands, crying my eyes out. I was weak, pathetic, and letting everyone down. I didn't want to admit to having failed. These components demonstrate the ways in which depression is socially constructed. It's also psychologically conditioned, and it's also intimately related to the physical states that people present with when they experience mental illness and other forms of depression. And this is something which is crucial to many people who study mental illness and society more generally, and in our case, elite sport. If one is to begin to arrive at some form of explanation then for why it is that elite athletes begin to experience mental depression, just like many other people in society, elite athletes are by no means unusual, apart from the particular sporting pressures to which they're subject. Then one central concept which straddles both psychology and sociology that is central to our understanding is that of stigma, which Irving Goffman described quite nicely as an attribute that is deeply discrediting for people, both to elite athletes and to many people who are identified clinically or otherwise as having mental illness or depression. In the case of athletes, one might argue that, as in the case of Robert Enke in particular, the stigma which was associated with mental illness formed what Goffman would call his spoilt identity. He was not seen as a normal elite athlete. Will Cochran goes on to argue in a similar vein about the paradox of normalcy and how, in trying to seek to become normal, one actually becomes further away from normal than one originally intended. And a lot of this is related to the perceived stigma that people experience from being identified as needing to be observed in case one commits suicide. And many lay people would argue a similar thing, I think. What is equally significant, though, beyond the social stigmatising which underpins much of the experiences of mental illness and depression that is reported by athletes and people in society, is the medicalisation of life. Medicalisation of life is an important part of any explanation, I think, of stigma and mental illness. And many of our lives have only become increasingly medicalised since the 1950s and 1960s. And indeed, medicine is now a form of major social control in our lives. Many of the people in this room are drinking water. Many of you will have taken paracetamol, ibuprofen, and many other kinds of tablets to manage one's physical conditions. And the argument that is beginning to be advanced in the literature by authors such as Cashmore is that the medicalisation has helped to transfer mental illnesses like depression into something which is a physical symptom that can be treated like any other physical illness like cancer, heart disease, obesity and so on. Now, what is increasingly notable, depression by name wasn't actually defined as a condition until the late 1980s, 1990s, so it's a relatively recent phenomenon. Even though, prior to that, many of the treatments related to mental illness and what we now term as depression were broadly couched under the terms anxiety, mood disorder, and so on. And indeed, one of the first drugs that was developed to combat the effects of those mood swings, anxiety attacks, and so on was Prozac, which wasn't formally introduced to the market until 1987, some 30 years after the medicalisation of life had really begun to take precedence. So for people like Cashmore, depression is increasingly treated and seen, he argues, by many athletes as a physical illness. And this has helped to increase the range of conditions that are deemed to be requiring some kind of medical intervention. Cashmore, and I think it's probably worth quoting a couple of sentences from his recent contribution to the literature. He argues that much of the disgrace of mental illness, I quote, has been removed, leaving athletes who have suffered to record their experiences in autobiographies, such as the kind I mentioned earlier. He goes on to say that conceptualising mental disorders, especially depressive disorders, as physical illnesses, has been an effective way of erasing the stigma. I emphasise the word erasing the stigma, and encouraging more openness among athletes. He argues, in conclusion, the newfound confidence of athletes to discuss their mental problems is due in large part to a medicalised understanding of its status. Now, I would argue that insofar as medicalisation is important, it is by no means the only explanation, and indeed we can't begin to explain the medicalisation of life and the connections with mental illness in such a one-sided and simplistic manner which characterises Cashmore's general thesis. Indeed, I don't think that many athletes would subscribe to that view, because if it is in fact the case that the stigma associated with mental illness has been erased, then why is it that we don't see many more elite athletes disclosing their experience of mental illness? After all, if 1 in 5 people in society more generally are thought to be experiencing mental illness of one kind or another, there are considerable more athletes who have not disclosed their mental illness thus far, which would not necessarily fit the thesis as it is advanced by Cashmore. And indeed, what he fails to take into account, sociologically at least, is an equally significant process which has characterised societies such as Britain since the Renaissance period. In addition to medicalisation, which has been characterised by these 4 features: a dependency on professionally provided medical care, i.e. going to doctors to be diagnosed with mental illness, the growing dependency on drugs in what Houlihan calls the pill-dependent society in which we live, where we take drugs to manage the symptoms of mental illness rather than the physical symptoms, and then the emphasis on prevention and expectations. The emphasis on prevention rather than cure. What isn't taken into account within those processes, which is nevertheless central to them, is a process of what we might call the individualization of life. The individualization of life is something which characterises society, as I mentioned earlier, from the Renaissance period. It's been a very long-term, gradual, yet uneven process to which we, all people in this room, will have experienced in some form or another. Indeed, many of us in this room now live in societies where we are under particular social pressure to demonstrate one's individuality within social relationships, whilst also belonging collectively to other groups. Norbert Elias went on to argue in this connection that people's freedom, many highly individual people's freedom, is valued. Their ability to act on their own responsibly and to decide for themselves, in short, to be different, is something which many people living in modern societies, such as our own, value. Yeah? Equally, we simultaneously experience, as part of that, a whole range of feelings, including a greater isolation from others, and feelings of separateness, and encapsulation of individuals in their relations to each other. We may be becoming more and more interdependent or interrelated with more and more people within society, but at the very same time we're also becoming increasingly isolated from them in various ways. This two-edged character of individualisation, as Elias put it, is underpinned by this gradual shift in the balance between the we identities of people, in other words, the identities that we as groups of people hold, in favour of an I identity. In other words, what is my own personal identity in contrast to those of other people with whom I'm related. And that is integral to the development of what he calls our social habituses. In other words, the ways in which we come to learn to do things in rather second nature ways, things that become automatic to us. And it also reflects our tendency increasingly to see ourselves as what he called homoclausus. In other words, many people who experience depression are more likely to conceptualise themselves as individuals, isolated from other groups of people in society, rather than people with whom we're interdependent in many cases. So as isolated individuals rather than an individual part of social groups of one kind or another. And it's within these social relationships and the consequences of those for health that the famous sociologist Tom Sheff, who writes from the perspective known as figurational sociology, argued that shame, in his view, is the social emotion. I emphasise the word "the" because those are his terms. He argued in his book, Being Mentally Ill, argues that any sociological understanding of mental illness, such as depression, must acknowledge how shame, which derives from our social and relational bonds with others, is arguably the social emotion between people. It is, in short, the opposite to pride. That is, the social emotion, shame, is intimately linked to the increasing individualisation and the ways in which we seek to manage both our public faces and our private social worlds. And this general idea of shame as a key social emotion and social problem, which underpins mental illness, is reflected in Wilson and Pickett's comment, although they don't express it as such. They argue that we may, by the standards of any previous society, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years or so, we may become highly self-conscious, obsessed with how we appear to others, not just physically, but mentally, yet worried about how we might come across as unattractive, boring, stupid, or whatever. I've fallen foul on all three of those thus far, and constantly trying to manage the impressions we make to others. That, for them, is one of the key features of contemporary social relations. And there's an aspect of these changing social relationships which map very closely onto health inequality, is that social evaluation anxiety is how we perceive ourselves. How we perceive ourselves on a day-to-day basis to the people whom we know, but crucially to those who we do not know. Increases our vulnerability in many complex ways. I haven't got time to go into how that occurs here today, but perhaps that's something that we can return to later on. But the final point, which relates specifically to society, so I'm including elite athletes here in everything that I've said, is that in contrast to all of the available opportunities that we can engage in our leisure time and indeed our sporting interests, if people are indeed interested in sport, is that modern societies, with a hint of irony, are actually very unexciting. There are, of course, exciting opportunities to engage in during our free time, but actually there are fewer channels now through which we can be openly emotional, openly excitable, in a manner that does not attract social apprehension or disdain in some ways. One consequence of this is that our lives have become increasingly routinized, and there are fewer opportunities for us to engage in the open emotional expression which may have characterized societies in previous decades. And indeed, we're now living in societies that in many cases make us emotionally stale. That you go to work, that you study in routine ways, begins to lock people in modern societies into rather repetitive means of living and leading their lives. Now that, I think, is characteristic not only of society, as I've said earlier, but also of elite athletes. And of course, it would be churlish to deny that there are some sport-specific processes, which I will just list here, given the time and perhaps the different experiences that people have in the room, that are associated with the particular pressures to which elite athletes are subject during the course of their day-to-day lives. Many of us will be exposed, particularly through the media, to these glamorous celebrity athletes who should be grateful for what they've got, in inverted commas. But the reality of elite sports people in the modern world is that they are regularly subject to what might be described as a culture of risk. There is now a well-established literature within the world of sport, particularly the sociology of sport, which routinely identifies the ways in which athletes are expected to deal on a day-to-day basis with the recurrence of pain and injury, of being isolated and stigmatised for being injured, as being a non-producer, as many people in elite sport would suggest. That becomes part of their identities, and many athletes who are routinely injured are often stigmatised quite negatively because of that, how does that begin to place a significant degree of emotional pressure and baggage on elite athletes? I mentioned earlier the medicalisation of life, and that has indeed begun to encompass sport. Elite athletes are often treated not because they are patients, but because by their very nature they are athletes. And they are people who are seen to have things wrong with them that need improvement. They are machines that require improvement. Elite athletes are abnormal people. The things they do are abnormal. The exercise regimes to which they're subject, the irregular sleep patterns, the excessive diets, whilst they may be shared by some people within the wider society, are actually quite disruptive to the body, and that may be associated in many cases to the physical, psychological and social connections that are associated with mental illness. Secondly, it is quite clear that particularly in the 1945 period, since the Second World War, sport has become less about amateurism, much more about professionalism. And the costs of professionalisation of sport has been to increase the pressure on athletes to succeed, whether that is through winning particular events or whether it's just simply completing individual activities. That is demonstrably the case, and that would in part be part of the explanation of the medicalisation of mental illness. It's also crucial that the sport has become much more politically important. Athletes no longer only represent themselves, they represent nation states, they represent particular countries and themselves as well as their families. They're not just representing individuals. There's a lot more riding on it, as athletes would say, than just me simply performing well. And added to that, two further processes which are also related here, is that sport is becoming, particularly at the elite level of course, increasingly commercialised. There are greater rewards to athletes for success, but equally there are greater risks and costs for those who fail to win. Elite sport by definition can only be attainable in terms of success by a very few number of athletes. For every one winner there are several thousand of losers. And what impact does both winning and losing, high-pressured situations and games, have on the mental state of elite athletes? We can only hypothesise about those. And those processes are not yet fully understood and certainly require much more consideration and serious thought than has been given to them so far. But what do we know then? I could have perhaps just presented this slide because this summarises my knowledge of this area. 4 points. Mental illness is the result of a complex interweaving of both society and biology, of both sociology, both of social pressures, psychological pressures, and physical or biological pressures, where both have to be understood as working together in complex and dynamic ways. Many of us who may be persuaded more by the psychiatric or psychological argument would do well to pay equal attention to the psychological and the biological arguments, and vice versa, if we are to better understand the rather underexplored relationship between mental health, depression and elite athletes. It's equally the case that elite athletes, who are normal people in abnormal circumstances, are not immune from mental illness despite their statuses and lifestyles. In many cases, it's often the case that elite athletes engaging in sport will experience mental illness and depression because of their status and lifestyles. It is also clear, as the last slide indicated, that elite athletes are subject to particular sporting pressures that many of us in this room perhaps have never been or will ever be exposed to. And those pressures may, in turn, compound the broader constraints on those within society more generally to experiencing mental illness of one kind or another. And finally, this presentation, like many others that have been perhaps conducted elsewhere, is rather limited, as I mentioned earlier, because we simply don't know much about the experiences of athletes who report experiencing mental illness or depression throughout their careers, whether at the start, continuously, or after major life-changing events. But it may be appropriate to argue that those athletes whose experience are known publicly, such as those that I've identified today, are likely to represent only the tip of a very large iceberg. And the challenge, I think, for many people working within all of the professions with an interest in mental illness is to begin to better understand what for many athletes would regard as a taboo in the world of modern sport and indeed in modern society more generally. I think I'll stop there and see how we go.
Thank you very much, Andy. That certainly opened my eyes up a little bit to depression in elite sport. So we've got a couple of minutes now for any questions. If I can ask, I'll pop this microphone in there, and then if we can speak into the microphone so that the camera can pick it up as well. So has anybody got a question?
Thanks, Andy. That was really, really interesting. I just wanted to ask, given your comments on the medicalisation of sport and society more generally, are you arguing that medicalisation is a good thing in the context that you're able to identify problems for elite sports, people that you maybe couldn't have dealt with before?
I'm not entirely sure what I am arguing, actually. But no, I think, in all seriousness, I think whether we regard it as a good or bad thing is neither here nor there. In terms of the medicalisation of life and sport more generally, it's clear that it has a double-headed character. On the one hand, the medicalisation of sport has helped athletes to recover from injuries, to better understand the performance that they are expected to produce if they're to be successful. And we can certainly know now better so many of the conditions which athletes report as a consequence of sport and exercise. But equally, one kind of unintended outcome of the medicalisation of life is that, particularly in the world of elite sport and indeed society generally, what was once physical conditions, or what were once mental disorders or seen as mental disorders or anxiety, are now repackaged, just like many other forms of medicine. So, in fact, there is now a pill for depression, antidepressants, Prozac. In the famous book written in America in 2004-05, the book called Prozac Nation, that actually the simple way to deal with a very complex problem like mental illness is to take a tablet. What that doesn't do is to change the broader structural relations or problems which underpin mental illness and depression. So I don't think it's a case of saying it's good or bad. I think it's a case of arguing that there are differential outcomes of medicalisation, one of which may be construed by athletes as being more positive to get them back playing or competing quickly. But actually, it may come to further exacerbate the tendency that you can control your own health in many cases. So medicalisation is in part linked to the ideology of healthism, I think, that it is your individual responsibility to manage your own health, whether that's physically or mentally. And if you don't, then you are stigmatised further for a lack of moral rectitude, perhaps, potentially. I don't know. That's what I would suspect.
Just on the question of medicalisation, I mean, I think in general terms, particularly about mental health, saying that there is a pill to be able to resolve everything is entirely the wrong thing to consider, because I think there is a perception in society that is the case, and quite evidently it's not. Otherwise, there wouldn't be quite so many people who are that have mental health problems. I think what you said earlier on, and what some of the athletes were saying, is that actually it's a very wide-ranging thing. It's not just about a pill. It's about your social situation. It's about the person that you are. It's about how you actually see yourself in that situation. And I think that's really very much more important than saying that if you take Prozac or whatever, and there were antidepressants before that, of course. I mean, there's been medication for depression that's been around since before the Second World War. But having said that, it's not just about the pills. It's about all of the other things together. The pills may help. They may help actually get you to a position where you're actually able to start to see what position you're in. But actually, the pills aren't going to make you better. It's going to be a lot of other things that are going to do that. No,
absolutely. I think everything you said I would strongly agree with. And I think a crucial point which I think you mentioned, and that isn't always discussed, certainly in the psychological literature related to sport, so I might be revealing my ignorance of some of the mental health literature, is the plural, instead of depression, depressions. Actually various forms of depression and depression. They're more adequately seen along a continuum. Whereas for some people it might be more about social circumstance, it might be life-changing events, and it might be those two in combination with many other situations in which they find themselves. So I think this kind of culture of a quick fix, a pill for mental health, a pill for weight reduction, a pill for many other social problems, is actually endemic of this kind of societal view of the need to do something quickly and to act individually rather than to address deeper-seated, more complex problems such as that. And I think that's one of the crucial things that I think is important to note, because certainly in relation to the diet pills that were first released, some people who used diet pills when they didn't have the desired effect. There's actually some evidence to suggest that actually makes people's perception of themselves worse in the first place than actually not having the desirable body shape in the first instance. So there are lots of dangers about recommending pills just as a means of quick fixing health problems, I think.
Just on that point, I mean, the problem, of course, for athletes, particularly in taking any medication, is whether or not it contains any banned substances. And I think that one of the reasons that athletes are unhappy, particularly elite athletes, unhappy about taking any medication, is that if it turns up in a drug screening, what will it actually say? And this goes back to the stigma that's attached to mental illness anyway. And
to make that problem even worse, it is the nature of the culture of elite sport that athletes need to get back quickly as soon as. Kelly Holmes, for example, one of the reasons why she self-coped by cutting herself is that she couldn't get back quick enough. She couldn't recover quickly from injuries. An elite athlete's career is very short comparatively to many of our careers. And I think that further compounds that kind of complex problem. So they can't use the pills, they would need to get back quickly. And how does that then begin to impact on their mental state of mind when they can't deal with those pressures?
Andy, one of the things that we're encouraged to do sociologically is to look at things developmentally. But one of the problems with depression, of course, is it's relatively new, as you mentioned. I'm thinking also of things like behavioural problems with young people, with young kids, attention deficit disorder, things like that. How do we know that levels now are higher than they were before, or is it just that we know more about the symptoms of it so we can identify them?
Chicken and egg question that I won't answer because I don't know the answer. But it's a good point. I mean, I think one of the things which, particularly in relation to Prozac, when it was first when it was first available in America, there was a study done between 1991, I think it was around 2004, 2005, which demonstrated a 300% increase in the prescription of Prozac. Now, what the authors argued is this a real terms increase in people who are presenting with mental disorders, or is this an actual consequence of the medicalisation of life? There are pills that can now be prescribed for people not only who are clinically diagnosed with mental illness, but whose symptoms may be seen to be an indication that they are experiencing mental illness. So some people, you can be prescribed those kinds of drugs, not only if you're not clinically diagnosed with a mental disorder of one kind or another. That's one of the arguments that relates to ADHD as well. Is it that actually ADHD is increasing, the number of people with ADHD is increasing, or is it that doctors are simply prescribing more? And at the moment, it's very difficult to establish that because you don't know what the before and after is. There's no kind of control group, and there's certainly no before and after situation. But I think if you move beyond that question, which can take you probably down a cul-de-sac, or even though it's meaningful and it's important to do that, to establish the scale of that problem, the deeper lying issues are, well, what does this tell us about the medicalisation of disorders and lives more generally, and what are the implications? Because if doctors are prescribing that, then what are the implications in that way?
That's great. Thank you very much for all your questions. I think we better leave it there. And if we could just say a thank you to Andy.